Okay, very warm welcome everybody to another talk in our lecture series, Stockholm Plus 50, 5 Decades of Global Environmental Governance. My name is Lena Partsch. I'm Professor of Comparative Politics at the Otto Suhr Institute, and I organized this lecture series because I would like to take stock with you of, by now, 5 decades of global environmental governance. Our starting point is the Agenda 2030, and today with the Sustainable Development Goals, and today we would hear about SDG number 12, responsible consumption and production. And our guest speaker is Magnus Bengtsson. It's a great honor to have you here online. A very warm welcome, Magnus. Before you start your talk for about 45 minutes, one of the students who organized this series with me, Kati Lehmann, she's going to present you, to introduce you.
Thank you, Lena.
Okay, yeah, hello everyone from my side as well. It is my very great honor to introduce Dr. Magnus Bengtsson today, who, as we just heard, is going to talk about SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production. He is an expert on sustainability with a focus on public policies related to consumption and production and circular economy. So for instance, he also built up and led a sustainable consumption and production area at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, where he had been working for 10 years. Before that, he not only gained his PhD in environmental systems analysis from Chalmers University of Technology in his native country, Sweden, but also gained degrees in industrial engineering and management and also in history. Therefore, it is no surprise that he can draw on about 20 years of experience in conducting and leading interdisciplinary policy-oriented research and advisory all over the world. To go with it, he's part of Future Earth, which is a global network of scientists, researchers, and innovators who are collaborating from different kinds of fields for a more sustainable planet. Furthermore, he works as a policy lead at Berlin-based Hot or Cool Institute, a think tank that explores the intersection between society and sustainability. Last but not least, Magnus Bengtsson is a lecturer at Tokyo University in Japan, where he used to hold a postdoc position, and from where he's, I guess, now attending and holding today's lecture. So in the spirit of international exchange and research, welcome again from Berlin to Magnus Bengtsson. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing you talking about realizing sustainable consumption production beyond neoliberal governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kati, for introducing me. And good morning to all of you. I hope it's not too inconvenient to connect at this hour. I know that usually these lectures are held later in the day, but it would have been a bit too late for me given the time difference here of 7 hours. As Kati said, I'm based in Japan. I've lived here for almost 2 decades, worked extensively across Asia. And as she also said, it's a kind of funny coincidence that I'm also working part-time for an organization that's based in your city, Berlin. So it's always a bit of a challenge to know exactly what to focus on when talking to a new group that you have never interacted with before. But for that reason, I think it's very good that we have these 2 parts, that's a presentation part and a Q&A. So I will give a brief introduction or a basic introduction to make sure that we have the same perspective. I think sure that many of the things I say will be known to many of you, but I think it's good to emphasize a few kind of concepts and perspectives that I think we need to have in common. And then based on that, we can follow up with further questions in the latter part of the session. So with that, allow me to share some slides I prepared for today. Should be coming on here. So one of the starting points here for the presentation, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the framework in the picture here, the 9 planetary boundaries that a group of researchers came up with for a number of years ago. They tried to identify the critical Earth processes that we, human society, depend on and that are currently under risk from what we do. And to set planetary boundaries, to set limits of the safe levels that we should try to stay within or beyond. And over time, scientists have elaborated this framework more. They have added more data, and they have worked more on trying to set targets for categories that were not initially quantified. And this is the latest iteration of this framework. Now, what is obvious in this picture is that based on these scientists' assessments, we have already passed the safe limits for a number of these planetary boundaries, which means that we are in the zone where the risks are accumulating and getting more severe over time. What's not obvious from this picture is that these risks are also interrelated with each other, that they help driving each other. So, for example, when we make changes in land use, that also affects climate change. Changes in climate change is also affecting ocean acidification. Biogeochemical flows, as you see in the bottom, is also undermining biodiversity. It's killing species in the water systems. So there are these interrelationships so that they can cascade and drive impacts in other areas. And what ecologists are saying is that many of these impacts that are caused by these risk areas are not linear. It means that we can see relatively limited impacts, and we continue to put these systems under increasing stress, and the stress is increasing over time. We see relatively small impacts, but then at some point things start to get much worse. So those non-linearities are things that ecologists have many times observed on smaller scale ecosystems like individual lakes or forest areas and so on, that they have a certain resilience up to a certain level, and then they see rapid and dramatic changes. And that is likely to be the case also with these large scale ecosystem functions that are part of this framework. Now it seems like I got stuck here. My screen doesn't move. Okay.
It's still the same slide for us, yeah.
Yeah, for me also.
Now we're back to the
back to the exactly. Is this so slow? Stop sharing and go back again. See if that improves anything.
We could also turn off our videos just for the moment. Now it seems to work.
Okay, can you see now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so this is just one of these planetary boundaries, climate change. And just to highlight the speed of change, the speed that's needed to get back to the safe levels here in one of these areas. Climate is talked about a lot, and we can see here that the curves we need to follow here if you want to limit climate change in line with the Paris Agreement. You have the green line here for 1.5 degrees, the blue one for 1.7, and the red one for 2 degrees. It's quite a staggering speed of change that's needed. And we need to keep in mind also that this is for the world as a whole. Then, of course, if you want this transition to be fair, it means that rich countries like the ones where we are living would actually need to decrease their emissions even faster than shown in this graph. So this is not a small challenge we have in front of us. And although there is a lot of focus currently on climate change and carbon emissions, we also need to be aware that we are facing these multiple crises. Some of these were featured in the planetary boundaries concept I showed before, but some are more social crises of increasing inequality, for example, lots of trust in each other, decline in democracy, things that I'm sure that you are talking about a lot in the program that you are part of. So many of the crises that we are experiencing here, these socio-ecological crises that are all related with each other in one way or another, are a reflection, I would say, of an economic system that is no longer fit for purpose. It's an economic system that assumes that there are endless natural resources and there is endless space to put our waste and our excess gases. But we are increasingly realizing that that's not really the case, that there are real hard limits that we need to understand and start respecting. So the current system that we are living in requires more or less overconsumption, but it also creates huge inequalities and leaves many basic needs unmet. So we have a huge inequality in the system. We have a situation globally where we have widespread underconsumption, hundreds of millions of people or even billions of people that are under-consuming. They consume less than needed to live in health and dignity. But on the other hand, we have hundreds of millions or billions of people consuming more than is ecologically sustainable, and definitely more than our fair ecological share, people who are over-consuming. So we have this double challenge of overconsumption and underconsumption that needs to be addressed simultaneously. And of course, I mean, these two parts of the system are not unrelated with each other. It's not a coincidence that we see this kind of pattern. The reason why many people are able to engage in mass consumption is also that many people at the bottom of the pyramid are severely underpaid for the hard work they do. And so there is a system of kind of a systemic exploitation built into the system. I skipped these points that I had here. This is an image that I often put up when I talk about global development, and it comes from a report from, here it says UNEP, but it's been also in other UN publications a number of times. So these dots all represent countries in the world. You can see that different colors represent countries in different regions. And on the horizontal axis, you have the Human Development Index, which combines a country's GDP as an indicator of ability to get educated, to get a job and a livelihood, to have a decent income. Education, which is another kind of fundamental element of human well-being, and life expectancy, which is of course an indicator of people's health and the healthcare system in a country. So this is a commonly used index for ranking countries and their human development performance. But then we see on the vertical axis the ecological footprint, which is a way of measuring how much area of the surface of the planet that one individual needs to support his or her lifestyle. So depending on how much we consume and how we live, our ecological footprint can vary. So here we can see, of course, a very clear pattern that the poor countries with a low human development index are also consuming very little, but we see that the wealthy countries have a high level of consumption. We would, of course, like to see all countries gravitate towards the bottom right corner here, which we can call the sustainability corner, where all countries would have achieved a high level of human development with an ecological footprint that is sustainable over the long term. But as you can see, there are currently almost no countries in this box. Either they are in a situation of social underdevelopment or ecological overshoot. And the conventional way of thinking about development and the way many practitioners in the development community are operating is that the job of these countries is to try to become like the rich countries, to try to adopt the same kinds of technologies and to grow their GDP and to improve the lives of their citizens through these efforts. But sorry, it became a bit messy here. But you can see the blue arrow here. Move the screen here. You can see the blue arrow here, the conventional development. If all the poor countries follow this conventional paradigm, this would soon lead to an ecological collapse. I mean, we see giants like China and India moving up the ladder and how that is driving resource consumption and energy consumption, emissions of greenhouse gases and so on at the global scale. So what's needed instead is definitely a kind of a very different approach to global development, where these countries would follow a very different pathway instead of just trying to emulate the rich countries, adopting their solutions, doing things like we do in the West or in the wealthy countries. Try to look more at how their own direct needs can be met differently. This will of course require a lot of innovation and creative thinking, which is easier said than done. Also combining high tech with more traditional practices and stronger focus on well-being instead of economy. I will talk more about the relationship between well-being and economy later. But at the same time, of course, we have the wealthy countries that are currently over-consuming many times over, that we need also to make drastic changes in our lifestyles and consumption pattern and start to scale down using substantially less energy and resources, but of course do it in such a way that we don't start to decrease our life expectancy and make people miserable and poorer in a sense. So this concept of SCP and this kind of academic tradition that has evolved around sustainable consumption and production is in this sense a challenge to the conventional development narrative. And it says that it's basically a flawed narrative, that this idea that poorer countries will be able to catch up by just following the path of the developed countries is actually not going to work out. Sorry about that. It's not very nice to be ironic about this, because this is of course extremely tragic, but this is just the hard reality we need to start facing. And all countries are currently deeply unsustainable. We are very far from the ideal of a sustainable society. Often we see this ranking of countries. Every year there is a global SDGs ranking. The country's performance on the sustainable development goals is assessed, and often countries in Northern Europe come up at the top, and well, people there are pretty comfortable and safe, but on the other hand they are over consuming, so it's not really a model that can be extended to the rest of the world. It's simply not possible. So all countries are deeply unsustainable, but they have very, very different challenges they are facing. And of course, wealthy countries have far greater resources in terms of finance and in terms of a well-educated population, in terms of access to technologies and so on. So with that, of course, comes an extra responsibility to help the whole globe transition to something more sustainable. In addition to, of course, taking action back home and transform the way we live. And when I talk about the need for reducing consumption in our high-income countries, this comes from a study I was involved in a few years ago. We identified 3 main reasons why we need to do this. And this is related to climate change, but it could be applied also to other kinds of ecological issues that we are facing. First of all, I mean, we have the situation of overconsumption and underconsumption. And for these people who are currently starving and don't have a roof over their head, in order for them to meet their basic needs and achieve a decent standard of living, we also need to give up some of our comfort, and that seems inevitable. So that's one of the reasons, the kind of ecological justice and the need to free up some ecological space for these people to live better. But also over the coming years, we need to make huge investments in rebuilding our society, that's shifting to renewable energy systems. Currently, 80% of the electricity comes from fossil fuels, and that needs to change drastically over the next 20, 30 years. The sooner the better. So we need to replace much of that with alternative sources of energy. And of course, that requires huge investments, both in financial terms, but also in material terms. We need lots of material, physical resources to build these wind power stations and PV cells and other kinds of facilities, transmission systems to build batteries, storage for energy. We need to refurbish our buildings. We need to have buildings that can be comfortable to live in, also with very little consumption of energy. It's not currently the case. We need better public transportation systems. So all this building, this kind of building boom that there is a need for in the coming years, will also drive major emissions and resource consumption because they will require lots of energy. So in order to have room for those emissions, and that we need to decrease the emissions from our consumption even faster than otherwise. And the third and final reason is also that just focusing on efficiency improvement, which tends to be the kind of the standard approach in many cases, that is likely to be insufficient. Efficiency sounds like a good thing, and I will talk a little bit more about this in the coming slide. But you may be familiar with this concept of decoupling, the idea that we can continue to have economic growth, but we can see greenhouse gases decoupling or going down, so that we can delink the economy from greenhouse gas emissions. Historically, we have seen very little of that happening. We see a few individual countries that have achieved some little decoupling in the recent years, but it's not at all of the scale that would be needed, and we don't see it happen at the global scale, which of course is what matters for the global climate. So back to efficiency and the challenge of relying on efficiency. This is actually data from a report by Lufthansa, and it shows how they have increased their transport performance. So they are flying more over this period of time. It's how many years? Yeah, roughly 15 years. The number of flights, or the number of people they transport, or person kilometers, or however they calculate this, has really increased drastically. And here they show also that their fuel consumption has more than doubled. So here, of course, they can say that there is an efficiency gain, that these aircraft have become much more efficient over time. And that must be a good thing. And of course, it is a good thing. But we see that we still have increasing fuel consumption. We have increasing emissions. So even though we have had a very significant improvement in efficiency, that has not managed to keep up with the increasing consumption. What has happened over this period of time is also that the cost of flying has really gone down tremendously. We have seen many more of these cheaper airlines. I think they have also cheaper flights in their portfolio. So we see people flying much more than they did in the 1990s. So as long as we have a strongly increasing consumption, efficiency by itself will have difficulties keeping up. And there is also something called the rebound effect, that efficiency can also fuel increasing consumption, because efficiency, this picture here, it shows the case of a car, because it's a good illustration of the decoupling, no, sorry, the rebound effect. It means if you shift to a more efficient car that maybe uses only half the gasoline, the amount of gasoline that your old car was using, it means that it will actually be cheaper for you to use your vehicle. So there is the chance that you will be either buying a car with a much bigger engine, and then you haven't really gained anything, or you will be driving more often and longer distances, and then you will also be consuming quite a lot of gasoline. Or if you don't do these things, you will just be driving as much as you did before. You will be using less gasoline, but then you will be saving money. And what will you be doing with that money? If you save over the year, maybe at the end of the year, that's actually become a quite big amount of money, and then you will spend that on flying to Thailand or wherever. And then, of course, all the benefits of having a more fuel efficient car are completely gone. And then there are other effects in the wider economy, so-called systemic rebounds, that further complicate this. But the point of this rebound effect, which has been well studied and well documented, is that efficiency has a tendency to not result in any major decreases in consumption. So we need to address consumption volumes directly, not just relying on improvements in efficiency. I mean, this is well known in the academic literature, but it's still very little recognition of it in political circles, and I think it has had a hard time to really penetrate the general mindset that we tend, it feels counterintuitive. We tend to think that efficiency must somehow lead to decreased resource consumption and emissions, but that's not always the case, or at least the benefits can be much smaller than we would have assumed. Now, when we talk about sustainable consumption and production, it's part of this broader concept of sustainable development. And I think all of you are familiar with this classic definition of sustainable development from the Brundtland report that came out in 1987, many years before you were born. But it talks about meeting the needs of those of us who live currently without undermining the opportunities for future generation to live well. So it's about intergenerational justice. We should think about the future. So that's of course one important principle. But on the same page, actually, on the following paragraph of this report, they actually wrote a few things in addition to that are often forgotten or ignored. They also said that when we pursue a sustainable development, we also need to make sure that we prioritize the needs of the poorest, that we make sure that we shape our economy, our increased capacity to produce goods and services in the economy, not just to benefit those of us who are already well off and well fed and well dressed, but that it's focused on actually improving the living conditions of the poorest. So that's one important principle that's often forgotten. And in addition to that, they also stressed the need to respect ecological limits. They said that there are ecological limits and we need to respect them. We need to study them scientifically, and we need to find ways of restraining ourselves and our economic activities, our consumption, so that these boundaries are not transgressed. And I showed, of course, on my first slide that currently we are not at all respecting these ecological limits. We are really living in a situation of of deep overshoot, and especially those of us who are living in wealthy countries. So here we have the 17 development goals that you will all be familiar with. They were adopted in 2015, and they will guide development until 2030. So we are almost halfway now with the implementation of these goals. There will be a midterm review next autumn, 2023. But when we look at these 17 goals, they seem to be freestanding individual goals, and there's really no effort to prioritize among them. They all seem to be equally important, and the SDGs text and the agreement doesn't really say anything about the linkages among these goals, how they are related to each other. So what's hidden here under the surface is that there are many synergies, many positive ways in which these are related, but there are also many tensions, that there are maybe goals here that are not really compatible. We cannot achieve them at the same time. It's simply not possible. So there is not really a systems perspective behind the way these goals are formulated. It's a kind of a political wish list of unrelated good things that we all would like to see happen, but they may not be realistic in the real world. In the real world, we will probably need to set priorities, and we will need to face some of these tensions and trade-offs, and to see how we can reconciliate those. So this is a related picture where researchers, I think this comes from the Stockholm Resilience Center at the Stockholm University, have tried to sort these goals into different categories. And they say that we need to understand that the basis for human existence and for our society is really a functioning biosphere. If we fail to take care of this biosphere and these Earth systems, as you saw in the planetary boundaries, everything else is going to fail. This is what we base our society on, and our well-being, and ultimately also our economic activity. So to protect the basis is really the foundation for being successful here. And there is an alternative formulation here of the definition of sustainable development, which was formulated by a group of researchers back in 2013 and published in Nature. They talked about development that meets the needs of the present, exactly like the Brundtland classic definition, but they say while safeguarding the Earth's life support systems on which the welfare of both the current and the future generations depends. So that's an attempt to reformulate the classic sustainable development definition with an emphasis on the need to protect this ecological basis. So I think that's a perspective that's important to have in mind here for what it means to change systems of production and consumption in society. And this is another study that came out just after the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, were published. A network analysis that came from within the UN system, where they looked at the interlinkages. I said that these 17 goals, we don't see how they're connected with each other. But this was a relatively quick and early assessment of what these linkages look like. And what they found in this study was that the SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production is the most interlinked goal. It's the goal with the greatest number of linkages to other goals. And it's also a goal that has the potential to help dealing with the tensions between many other targets, between social objectives of getting rid of poverty, for example, and protecting the ecosystems and so on. changing our production and consumption system really sits in the middle of this and is at the core of achieving these multiple objectives. So it's not just one of these, it's included as one of the 17 goals, but it seems to be just one of them. But in fact, it plays a kind of a pivotal role for achieving many of the goals or kind of harmonizing the other goals. I realized that I've been talking for quite some time and we got started a bit late, but Lena, do you want me to continue talking for another few minutes?
Yes, please.
Okay. So if we look of course, governments have been taking action on SCP for a long time. It's been on the political agenda for several decades now. But the traditional or conventional way of doing it is to focus on actions by individual consumers, that educating consumers, providing consumers with information, thereby empowering consumers to take action. That has been the kind of way of thinking about how to achieve sustainable consumption production, that we are somehow that we are sovereign in our role as consumers, and that our buying decisions are very powerful, and that we can drive changes also in the production systems. We can vote with our wallets or our dollars for the kind of systems that we prefer. So if we want something more sustainable, if we want something low carbon, if we want something that don't threaten to lead to deforestation, then that should be reflected in the way we consume. So we should align our consumption with those values. But so typically what's done here is to raise awareness and educate consumers and provide things like eco labels and so on, so that we can distinguish which would be better products in the marketplace. But I mean, this has been going on for decades, and we still see that little progress has really been achieved. And this is something that has been studied by scientists for a long time now, why this is the case. And there is a large and growing literature on the limitation of this individualistic approach to achieving sustainable consumption and production. And there are many reasons why this kind of customer is king approach doesn't really work in practice. And I listed some of the more important reasons here, that many of the things we do are not very well reflected. We just do them habitually. When I make coffee in the morning, I don't really consider how this is affecting the planet, and so it's something I just simply do because I've been doing it for years. And things are embedded in social practices, and we do them and we don't really reflect much of their implications. We are also very much affected by prices, of course. In many cases, more sustainable options can be more costly. In some cases, they are maybe not at all available in the market. Many people try to avoid buying things that are wrapped in plastic these days, but it's almost impossible because they're simply not available on the shelves. So the choices are limited. And also being part of society that is kind of affected by consumerist values, and where also the political system and the big economic players are also encouraging us to consume more and more, and they're enabling increasing consumption by making it easy for people and cheap for people to borrow money for increasing consumption. I mean, given all of these reasons, we also have advertising, of course. There is a reason why billions of dollars are spent on advertising each year. It pays back. People buy more. Because of all these reasons, it's really like swimming up a waterfall if you try to make consumers shift the production and consumption system towards something that's close to sustainable. So what we need instead is of course collective action. We need collective decisions to take us out of this straitjacket of overconsumption, or this iron cage of overconsumption. So we need better political decisions, better regulations to get rid of damaging products in the marketplace, better regulations on production systems, tax systems that are aligned with what we want to achieve, protecting the ecological basis, massive public investments in the things that are needed, but also bottom-up action, grassroots actions at the community level, working with local communities to try to shape more sustainable lifestyles, to amplify social norms, talking more about these issues with each other, organizing actions to make our voices heard and to try to influence the political establishment. I mean, this is part of a growing movement that we can call new economy, a search for a new economy, and it has many. It's a kind of a diverse movement with many different strands, and not all of them are fully kind of aligned with each other. People are working in different silos and so on, but we can see that activity is increasing, and I think there is quite a lot of things happening in Germany. You have lots of think tanks and universities and also social movements that are doing lots of interesting things in this area. So things around circular economy, higher quality products, product sharing, that having access to products is maybe more important than actually owning them ourselves. So for things that we don't need to have on a daily basis, we can borrow them or rent them instead. Things like public libraries, for example, is a great invention, but unfortunately public funding is in many countries decreasing year by year. And that's just one simple example that with such collective solutions, investing money collectively, we can also provide equal access to things that many people can benefit from, and it can also have ecological benefits in terms of reduced need for consumption. So we can have many kind of win-wins in terms of social benefits and ecological benefits through this kind of sharing economy practices and working more with product lifetime extension and repair services. Downshifting is another component of this new economy movement, that people are cutting down their working time and accepting to live with a lower income. This, of course, is something that might also only be possible for people who have a relatively okay income to begin with. It's something that we cannot really expect people who are really struggling to make ends meet. But some people are coming to are realizing that this is actually something desirable. To have more free time and more control over one's time is something that's very desirable. And having less money means that maybe one cannot own a car. One has to accept to live in a smaller home. It becomes impossible maybe to fly on vacation. These kinds of things. But those may not be seen as huge sacrifices if we can do other meaningful things in our free time. So many people are experiencing this as something positive. So we see lots of social experiments in that space, but of course it's still not something that is going mainstream. And it's also something that is maybe challenging for individuals to shift. It requires changes also by the employers, and we need to change things like legislations related to labor laws and other things. I mean, it's been a downward trend in working time for a very long period of time, for hundreds of years, but in recent years it has kind of got stuck on a 35 or 40-hour working week, and some people say that it's time now to take the next step and shift to a 4-day working week. to develop skills related with production instead of just meeting our needs in the marketplace, to learn how to do more things ourselves, more crafts-oriented things, producing some food ourselves. This, of course, is not maybe available to everyone, but it can be an option for some. But the benefits of this can be a greater self-reliancy, less reliance on the market economy when prices become volatile, and for example, if people have the ability to produce their own electricity, they are not so much affected when the electricity prices in the grid go through the roof. They can produce their own electricity and they are still fine. So it's about strengthening, part of prepping households for the kind of ecological crisis that we see unfolding and that are likely to get worse in the coming years. And with kind of related to the downshifting and having more free time available, strengthen social bonds in communities, emphasizing building social relationship instead of spending time on consumption, and shifting to more non-material need satisfiers and an increasing focus on well-being instead of consumption. I see there is some overlaps here. Just the final point here, I'm sure that many of you have heard the concept of degrowth, which is not the same thing as a recession, which is an uncontrolled contraction of the economy, which often leads to mass unemployment and lots of problems. But degrowth stands for a shift away from degrowth, that we reorganize society in such a way that it's not such a big problem for us anymore if the economy becomes stagnant, if there is no growth, or if the economy is even shrinking, we can still maintain people's well-being and people's materials or people's quality of life. I see that I need to wrap up here, and this was more or less my last slide. I just would like to get back to the SDG 12. I see here Lena is saying that you have already had a discussion about degrowth. If we look at how this Sustainable Development Goal number 12 in the SDGs framework is conceived, the targets that are there and the indicators, it relies mainly on efficiency improvements. And I talked about efficiency before, that there are these risks of rebound effects, which are not really considered. And it also relies to a high extent on consumer education and individual consumers as the drivers of change. And I also talked about the limitations of that approach, and that we need more collective action and collective decisions to shift the systems that we are part of. And it doesn't really make any indication of the need to shrink consumption overall. It's based on the idea that we can still, despite the ecological crisis we find ourselves in, continue to have a growing economy and a growing consumption. And it doesn't mention the need for shifting the opportunities for consuming to provide ecological space for development for people in low-income countries and in low-income groups also everywhere in the world. There is no recognition of the need for sufficiency or just consuming well in order to live well, to consuming enough in order to live well, as a complement to efficiency. Okay, with that, I wrap up and try to give a brief overview of my thoughts on SCP in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'd be happy to take questions.
Does anyone have any questions or remarks on the lecture? I can see Myro has raised his hand, please.
Yeah, in that case, I'll be the brave one. I jump in first. Can you understand me?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, perfect. First of all, thank you so much for this lecture. This was really interesting. And I really like the picture that you draw on personal consumption and the waterfall, because that really resonates with me. swimming up against the waterfall. My question, however, is more on a different level, and it regards the role of cities as on the one place sites of production and consumption on a global scale, but as well as actors. So what I'm interested to know is how cities in those both categories are able to influence those patterns of sustainable consumption. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a good one. Absolutely. Cities, I mean, about looking globally, about half of the world's population are now living in cities, and it's increasing year by year. And in high-income countries, it's even higher. And of course, people in cities tend to have higher incomes and consume more than people in rural areas. Not necessarily the case. Maybe the differences in high-income countries are maybe less than in poorer countries. You don't have the same dramatic urban-rural divide. But in cities, definitely there are many consumption areas that can be addressed. Like I talked about transport. I mean, if we look for climate change, the things that really matter are the food that we eat. That's a big chunk of emissions. And it's about the energy that we use, which is related with the size of our house and how we heat it or cool it, and the electronic devices we have there, cook our food, etc. That's another area. And it's how we move around. The mobility is the third big chunk. I mean, those are typically responsible for around 75% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and also for many other ecological stressors. Transport is a clear case where cities have a very strong role to play. First of all, zoning. Organize the city so that we reduce the need for mobility, that it's not too much spread out, and so that we don't have just a big residential area where we only have residential homes, and then we have the big shopping mall over here, so that everyone, every time they need a liter of milk, they have to go from here to here, but that we actually have a mixed city. I mean, this was an extreme example, but it's also about working places, schools, and so on, that things are accessible very close to where we live. Paris is now developing towards their vision of what they call a 15-minute city. That is one of the programs of their mayor, their female mayor. For some reason, many kind of future-oriented leaders in this field, they tend to be women. So that was a parenthesis. But the 15 minutes concept, it means that basically things that you need on a daily basis or weekly basis should be accessible within 15 minutes by foot or bicycle. And occasionally maybe you need to go a little bit further, and then there should be good quality public transportation so that you don't actually need a car. And they are working on multiple fronts. They're also making it more difficult and costly for people to drive cars, and they are planning to, they have removed several highways in the city, and they're making it very difficult to park a car and making it costly to park a car, and so these kinds of things. So there are many things cities can do, both to discourage undesirable behaviors, in this case driving individual cars, and to make it possible for people to adopt these more environmentally friendly behaviors like walking and biking. Many other areas that can be worked on. For example, cities can organize repair fairs, places where people can go to get their things repaired. We are often so handicapped, sorry to use that word in such a manner, but I know it's not the nice thing to say, but we don't often have the skills to repair things when they break. I mean, at least not I cannot do it. I'm very bad at those kinds of things. So when something breaks, I really cannot do anything. I need to rely on other people to have the skills and the tools and so on. But often it's difficult to find someone. And if you happen to find someone, it's often costly if it's done on a commercial basis. But we see some cities, they are setting up repair fairs or repair cafes where people gather on a voluntary basis help others repair their things that break. Can be furniture, electrical stuff, and so on. Here in Tokyo, where I live, there is something called the Toys Hospital. So, you know, toys these days, they are really weak and they quickly break, especially if they are driven by batteries and so on. And it's often something very simple. But for a person like me, I cannot do anything about it. But then they regularly hold these toys hospitals where people can go and get their toys repaired for free. And that's set up by the local municipal office here and so on. So, I mean, those are some very simple examples. Other things, I mean, cities, they are running the school canteens and so on, providing kind of vegetarian meals as an option that are attractive and that are described as something desirable, not just salad or whatever, but that it's actually a filling, interesting meal and building a good food culture that make people not even realizing maybe that they are eating a vegetarian or vegan dish. It's just a delicious food, and to foster that kind of mindset among young people that doesn't have to necessarily involve meat to be delicious and filling. So just a few scattered examples of what cities can be doing. It's a very fruitful area to work for SCP.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So I see Felix has another question.
Yes, thank you very much. I thought my question kind of fits to what you were talking about now, because I was wondering about these consumption corridors, which you mentioned in the book chapter and also now in the talk. It's obviously very interesting concept, but I thought also it sounds quite radical, because especially the top part is very difficult to, you know, bring people to consume in a sustainable fashion. I thought, okay, the only way is to like tax them very heavily so they don't have the money anymore to consume in these patterns. But now you also mentioned with cities some ways that this can be done also in a friendlier and a systemic manner. So maybe you can talk a bit about ways to, you know, bring down the top % or top 5% in this consumption corridor.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this top 5 and top 10 and so on, and it's true that, I mean, the abilities or the consumption is extremely unequal, both globally and within countries. If we look globally, almost half of the greenhouse gas emissions are related to the lifestyle and consumption of the top 10%. The top 1% is responsible for around 17% of emissions. And we see similar pattern if we look in Europe, that the people with high incomes have outsized ecological footprints and greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at the emissions from people with very high incomes, quite a lot of it is about mobility, having big thirsty cars, maybe multiple cars in a household, driving a lot and regularly, but also frequent flying. Flying is something that only a minority of people do, actually. Globally, 80% of people or more have never flown and will never fly in their lifetime. So it's a wealthy, kind of privileged minority that are flying. And those who are flying on a regular basis, it's actually a very small share of the population. And on top of that, we have these bizarre reward point programs that if people fly often, they actually get points so they can fly even more, which of course is completely crazy if we want to reduce consumption, and we shouldn't have this kind of schemes. So they should definitely be abolished to begin with. And people are also saying, or some researchers are proposing, that we should have the opposite, that we should have a frequent flyer levy or a tax, that if people fly more than abroad, fly internationally more than one time per year, then they have to pay a pretty hefty tax to discourage that kind of unsustainable behavior. And when it comes to mobility, I mean, we already have some rules on fuel efficiency and so on, but cars have become so much bigger and heavier and are using so much more fuel. And there's really no rationale why people who are living in a city should have a 2-ton car. An SUV is only really useful if you're running a farm in the countryside. For people who reside in cities, it should not really be allowed to have this kind of cars. I mean, it's provocative to say that because we are living in a society where individual freedom is very highly considered. But I mean, we are living in a kind of ecological emergency. I think more and more people are realizing that. And then we need to start pulling the emergency brake here, and we need to start talking seriously about some pretty drastic measures that not all people will like immediately. And you talked about these consumption corridors and the idea of consuming less, and for many people maybe it feels like something utopian and but I think one of the keys is to have more conversation about these things, that in many countries people have organized citizens panels or focus groups or so. They are gathering randomly selected citizens to meet up a number of times to discuss. First, they provide some input. They make sure that they have a kind of a factual basis for where we are currently with the climate crisis and other ecological issues that we are facing. And then they go through a series of dialogues where they talk about these issues and how it's related with their lifestyles and what kind of changes they would like to see in society. And the results that come out of these dialogues are often quite progressive. And what people in the end say that they would like to see are often very drastic changes and far beyond what I think many political leaders assume. And I think politicians in general need to show more leadership. They are really too coward, and they have a greater mandate than they realize, and they could actually move forward more quickly. But of course, there are probably reasons why they don't do that. It's not just the general population. They also are influenced quite heavily by corporations and people with lots of money and so on and so forth. So there are political economy reasons why this is not happening. Maybe not a perfect answer to your question, but I hope it gave some insights at least.
No, thank you. It was good.
Perfect. Now we do have several hands up. I would just go in the order. So Sophie, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. You're very much focusing on what we have to do in the future and how it is right now, but I wondered if we look into the past. So why has there been so much resistance to a sustainable transformation? Or could you maybe identify some barriers or some reasons why we are still not achieving this transformation?
That's a huge one. Of course, I mean the issues we are facing here, they are not really new. It's 50 years ago now since the Limits of Growth report was published. Many of you would be familiar with that. We have had the Framework Convention on Climate Change since 1992, so it celebrates 30 years this year. But still, we see that since 1992, greenhouse gas emissions have increased by over 60%. And we don't really see any respect for limits to growth yet. So why is this the case? I think there are many reasons that there's been a kind of a naive reliance on things that don't really work, that don't really deliver, that technology is going to solve this for us, and that better and more efficient products and production systems will somehow take us out of this dilemma. But as I said, there are limits to what we can expect from efficiency. there's also been an overemphasis on this individual consumers as the drivers, that it's mainly in our role as consumers in the marketplace that we are kind of expected to express our values and our desire for a more sustainable society and a sustainable future. But what we can do as market actors, as consumers, is really, really limited. And I mentioned a few of the reasons why we cannot really rely on consumers to be in the driver's seat here, that we need to see ourselves much more as citizens and talk more about environmental citizenship and what it means to be a responsible citizen in this era of ecological emergency. I think we have also seen, too few efforts to build bridges between social justice movements, like the progressive left and the labor union, and those who talk about global justice issues between South and North, and the environmental movements. That there's been a lot of suspicion maybe between these movements, and they have not always collaborated very well. Also movements on the political left and parties on the political left who could potentially have adopted these visions of kind of a slower society, a more ecological society, more based around community practices and conviviality. They have, bought the ideology of a kind of a growing society and a kind of an industrial, ever expanding industrial production system, that is the way to keep people's well-being, and it's the kind of the only way forward. As people have been too much indoctrinated in this kind of growth paradigm, and they have not been able to see anything else. And also that we are stuck in this system where humanity is divided up into 200 nations, roughly speaking, countries, and we are little tribes that are fighting with each other, or we are competing with each other. And competition can sometimes be good, but it makes it difficult for us to really collaborate well. Of course, some countries are much more powerful than others, and that is not always fully addressed. But governments are reluctant to really start making any drastic changes because they feel that their country and their population will lose out if they start to do something differently. But countries that kind of deviate from the predominant development paradigm, they run a risk of being punished one way or the other. So there's a fear of embarking on a different development path, of not building up an export industry and industrializing like countries are supposed to do, but to focus more on strengthening rural communities and focusing more on the country's own development needs more directly than indirectly through boosting exports and earning foreign currency. I noticed that I'm rambling here a little bit and walking back and forth. It's a very interesting topic, but also a very complex one. I hope that I gave a few beginnings of answers at least. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Then Lisa, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the informative talk so far and for answering the previous questions with a lot of examples. We talked a lot about sustainable consumption, and my question relates more to the second part, so to the sustainable production part of this, because it seems inevitable for me to achieve those goals. We cannot put all of the responsibility on the consumers, as you already said today, that there are limits to that. But it still remains unclear to me how we can actually make the private sector go along with us and produce less, because they are driven by this wish to maximize profits. We know this from the very basic economics lessons. and the wish of the political leaders to actually actively put limits on private companies is also limited. So I don't see really how, like, maybe you can exemplify also which measures can be taken, like how can we make the private sector to actually produce less and more sustainable?
Yeah, that's another huge one. Thank you. Well, first of all, we need to recognize that private companies, or the corporation as we know it, is a social construct. It has not always been around. It has a history, and it was designed for certain purposes in a time where there was a scarcity of investment capital, so that people could invest their money and they didn't need to engage themselves in running the business, but they left that to especially appointed executives to do that for them, and then they could get benefit from their investments. And it was designed in such a way that the corporation had as its sole purpose just to optimize or maximize the economic benefit of its owners, its investors. So that was done on purpose, and it was governments that agreed to do this. But now we are living in a world that looks very different, and maybe it's time to start questioning whether we want most of our economic life to be run in this way. Is the corporation, as it's currently designed and understood, really the optimal way of running most of the economic activity in a society when we need to respect the ecological limits and work towards a greater equality on the planet? We may find out that we have to organize our economic activities differently. And I mean, there are different models. There are people who set up cooperatives and other kinds of, we have worker-owned enterprises and so on. And these are actually more common than many people realize. And even in a country like the US that may look hyper-capitalist, and it is in many ways, they also have a fairly large sector of this kind of alternative economic types of organization. So I think that's one direction to look at to see how we can strengthen these kinds of other types of organizations that don't have profit maximization as their only rationale for existing, but that work more for the purpose of the community and the people who are involved in them, that we have more of this kind of direct relationship with communities, and that's one answer. There are many other angles to it, but I think you have to leave it at that for now, fortunately.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Then I think we are going to ask 2 questions now, because I have one from the chat as well and from Anna here in the session. And then maybe we can have some 2 quick answers because time is running. So in the chat, someone wanted to know what you think of the practice of ecotourism, like green hostels, agritourism, etc. If it's conflicting with the SDGs, or if you perceive it as a first step in the right direction. And then Anna, maybe you can ask her question as well.
Should I take the ecotourism quickly?
Okay.
Because I think it's a great idea, as long as it doesn't involve going on an airplane. So for Europeans to do ecotourism in Thailand, I think is complete nonsense, frankly speaking. But to do it back home, to go to and do volunteer work at an organic farm or whatever, I think that's a wonderful experience and can help raise awareness and also generate all kinds of benefits. So I think it's a very positive thing, but unfortunately, often it's part of the, I mean, the long distance tourism that requires flying, which unfortunately is something that we need to do less of.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I would like to know a little bit more about the combination of that you mentioned traditional practices with the modern technology. Yeah, that sounds really like one of the good ways to dock on to start solving the big heap of problems in this direction. But do you already maybe know about any like best practices or any examples where the research is going at the moment in that field? Thank you.
Traditional practices, drawing from my own work in Southeast Asia for many years, one example I can give is, for example, reuse of building components. Every time we build a new house, it's pretty wasteful if we need to do everything from scratch to make new windows and new doors and new tiles and so on and so forth. In many cases, these components, even when the building itself needs to be demolished, can be reused. And that is something that we try to do more and more in European countries. And there is a traditional practice of doing that in low-income countries and middle-income countries. But as countries modernize, as they adopt more new modern building practices, these traditional way of doing things are falling out of, they are not kind of becoming less and less feasible. So to find ways of continue to do this, to reuse components and maybe using internet-based platforms to help it easier for buyers and sellers to find each other, for example. That's one such thing of using traditional practices. But it can also be things around how to reduce food waste, of donating leftover food and so on to those in need, or to feed animals with leftover food, to have systems that make that safe and possible, or things like repairing things, repair services, but they can be upgraded so that it's easier to find the right people with the right skill sets and to have the right what is it called, components, spare parts. That can be a challenge, especially for more complicated products. So as products become more and more complex, it's becoming more and more difficult to repair them typically. So often poorer countries, they have lots of repair services, but as they develop, as they kind of modernize and their economy grows, they tend to abandon these practices. It's seen as something old-fashioned, and instead of repairing old clothes or fixing something, they just throw them away, just like many people in the rich countries do, and they think that that's the normal way to live a modern lifestyle. But it doesn't have to be like that way. I mean, repair services are tremendously beneficial. It can both create jobs and it helps us using our stuff for longer. But there can be ways of using modern tools like IT to keeping these practices alive and to make them economically feasible.
Okay, thank you so much, Magnus. I think we're running out of time just because of the recording and the live stream. But what we all learned, I think, is that there are a lot of ideas already available for a sustainable lifestyle. And yeah, we have to realize them, and that's the challenge. And one way how we can address the challenge is definitely, and I liked how you said this, that we need more collaboration, less competition and more collaboration. So thank you so much for this talk.
Thank you very much for listening and for excellent questions.